Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sue, Pravin, Ray. I think Helen is on as well. I wanted to share with you just a little bit on an emerging part of the market research process that traditionally has not received as much focus, a bit of the black box perhaps. I've been very passionate about it since it has both an impact on the consumers we speak to as well as the clients that we present to. So I'll walk you through over the next 20 minutes or so maybe a little bit less and keep us back on timing track here. So the notion of these online questionnaire design principles. So in terms of what we are going to look at today, we all know that the basic of questionnaires of questionnaire design is what we want to ask. Now, what we want to ask is probably a whole day all by itself, because as we've seen from the previous presenters, there's questions about awareness or usage, attitudes. You have all kinds of exciting types of quantitative designs, as we had just seen from Dirk as well. What I want to focus on is a bit more around the notion of how we visualize those questions. And this is an exciting time in research because once upon a time ago, we really just took a basic question and put it on a computer screen. And now, because technology has advanced so quickly, we've been able to visualize the context of those questions in all kinds of exciting new ways. What I've been passionate about is to understand two basic big ideas. One of them is, how does the visualization of a question impact the data consistency? And what is it that may or may not change once we ask a question in a visually different way? And ultimately, from a respondent point of view, how have consumers reacted to it from a usability perspective? So if we think about the question itself, this is what historically they would usually look like. We'd have rows and grids and tick marks, and we would ask a basic question in a basic way. And over time, perhaps we shaded the rows, the columns, but these are really what most online surveys used to look like, and frankly, the overwhelming majority today continue to look like. We would start to ask some questions around the survey experience. The notion of response patterns and flatlining means that if you see a big grid like this and you just say, oh boy, how do I get out of this question and go to the next one? The survey experience that you see as a grid here, the notion of flatlining is that someone would give everything a 7 or an 8 all the way down, and that would let them advance and just get off of this question. So the notion of survey engagement is that we would take some of those basic question types and make them better. And how we make them better is we use new kinds of flash technologies and other ways of enhancing them, put logos in, anything that can enhance the survey experience. And this notion of survey engagement really did get popularized over the last 3 to 4 years now. And a whole range of new firms are using technology as part of the mix in order to make surveys better. So how does that get operationalized? Well, you could slide things, you can drag things, you could start adding logos, and anything, and it's not the logo that makes it more engaging, but rather a series of new question types. So flash technology, like you see on the left-hand side of the screen, may put a slider on a question. For relatively inexpensive amounts now, you can enhance them with these drag and drops. And instead of asking someone, what do you own, you could simply show an image of it and have them drag it into the box like you see on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So there are certain types of questions that do matter when, and this is going to the heart of what is considered to be a normative way to ask the question. So the Net Promoter Score, NPS, that is used by many firms worldwide as a key metric, I had learned when I started looking into this notion of survey consistency, is actually a question that people vary a lot. And you could say, well, the algorithm of Net Promoter is you take the top 3 and you minus the bottom, and that's how you get your score. But what happens if you were to change it? And a question I just put harmlessly on the Net Promoter forum ended up being one of their most popular forum questions for several months. And it seemed to have raised a lot of questions about even how some of the most basic questions can have a visual amount of change to them. So why does that matter? Well, I do believe it matters on 2 fronts. One of them is, can you look at the data and say it will or won't change if you change the visual interaction that the question has online? The second is from a respondent usability point of view, and I'll touch briefly on some of the eye tracking work that we did. You can see that some of these questions are not necessarily so intuitive to consumers, and even in a lab environment when they're doing it. So they both do matter. And I know a lot of firms are doing a lot of usability testing now to make sure that the ergonomics of those questions also make sense. So the 3 studies that Pravin had mentioned were covered now over these past 3 years. And again, just I think my email address will pop up and my Twitter name at the end of the session. Feel free to email me, and I'm happy to share the results with anyone who wants it. The 3 basic studies have continued to explore, both from a data consistency point of view and also from a respondent usability point of view, these basic Flash and the most recently shared one on gamification. So, for example, in one of the earlier studies, we looked at some different visual ways of laying out a survey question. So on the top hand, what we call a radio button, there are no visual cues to guide someone. In this case, a 1 to 10 rating scale. Do you consider yourself simply to be an optimist or a pessimist? And they don't have any kind of visual cue on the question. They just simply fill out where on the 1 to 10 they want to give their answer. We experimented with 3 other cells where the anchor, on this case a slider type of question, was anchored on the left, the mid, or on the right-hand side. Despite all of the advances in technology, one of the things that still strikes me as somewhat unfortunate is that we don't really have any best practices today globally accepted on where even an anchor should be. On a usage question, on an awareness question, there are firms whose sliders are anchored on the 1, some of them on the midpoint, some of them I've seen are even anchored off scale. And hopefully one of the things that we'll continue to see are ways in which we can all perhaps agree from a research point of view what is the best way to do something, in much the same way that we have best practices and standards for so many other aspects of the research process. And that study had highlighted that when you do change the visual interaction of a survey, the actual what you see on the screen, even basic questions around usage, issue importance or awareness, something as benign as even how often you brush your teeth can change the results quite drastically. And in the most recent study, you can see here 5 different ways of laying out the exact same question. And we saw a 40% variance in the data. Now, one of the questions I think I had seen pop up on Twitter when we were presenting this was, well, then, which one is the truth? And that seems to be one of the most exciting questions, because we live in a world of multiple realities when you change the question type. And maybe, as someone had suggested, we've been doing it all wrong by using a very basic type of interface, because maybe we've been, in some cases like this, where we have a big, complicated question, have been underreporting it because consumers have only tried to go to the next question, and maybe the ways of engaging them through the greater use of Flash and game-based types of wording can actually help to get the right or a better answer. Now, it would be almost arrogant of me to suggest which one is the right answer or the wrong answer, because it's so contextual upon the business issues that someone is trying to measure. But I think what we need to agree on is that changing the way you ask the question visually on screen has the potential to create a huge impact in the data itself. And one of the ways that we've approached the learning is also recognizing that the wording, how you actually just change the way you ask the question, can have an impact on certain research fundamentals. So in this case, we're looking at the incidence of straight lining. Remember earlier, if you click the same answer all the way down on the page just to get off and go to the next one, we played with the wording in this case of a game-based one, which is on the bottom right. Instead of simply asking how familiar you are with each of these politicians, we asked them to attach a certain level of conviction to their answer by betting on it. So if you were really familiar, you would bet $20. If you were somewhat familiar, pretty sure, you would bet $10. And that basically reduced the amount of straight lining from 9% on the top left to just over 5.5% using the flash-based one, and it completely eradicated it when we didn't really make it an overly game-based type of question, but we used game wording. So no matter what type of interface you're using, you can create a more mentally engaging approach with people by also using words. And one of the things we also want to recognize is that a lot of surveys today are quite long. They may run 15, 18, 20 minutes long. So there is an impact on the questionnaire length because flash questions do take a bit longer. Sometimes we put multiple questions over multiple screens. Game ones take even longer, but we did recognize that they are having more fun. They're thinking more. So the real big win is any kind of visually or word-based interaction with people is going to increase overall survey enjoyment. Going from standard to either flash or game raises survey enjoyment, as you can see, by at least a point out of 10. And I'll show you just a couple of pieces from the eye tracking work that we've done. And eye tracking, for anyone who's not familiar with it, you can see on the left-hand side, here is the part where we calibrate people's eyes. So we are having them here in a lab environment. They're looking at something on the screen, and we can really monitor. People used it to validate search in the weight of 10 side first on a Google screen. And what we learned from eye tracking was taking a series of questions, basic types, using logos, drag and drops, and other types of visually engaging questions to really understand the journey. And this is an example of how you can use eye tracking with these areas of interest. And eye tracking is I've come to appreciate as a phenomenal way for us to learn about the survey experience from a consumer point of view. What you're looking at here are these defined areas of interest. I know exactly where someone is looking on the screen because I've predefined the areas that matter to me. The question, the rating scale, the question statements down the left-hand side, as you can see in pink. And then what we do is applied it to what did they look at. And this from the eye tracking study showed us that if you show an image big in the central part of your screen, but your question is very small, you have the potential for someone to not even read the question, but simply infer it. And we had a whole series of learnings, and I'd encourage you to look more into this because we can learn a lot as survey designers from usability experts. So what are some of the implications? Just make the font bigger in your question. Otherwise, we're going to assume that people know exactly what we want, which perhaps in the case of a gender question is fairly harmless. But what happens if we had the same set of brand logos that appeared on one screen to then the next? If people aren't reading the question, we would have some significant reservations about what they were really answering. So use basic things, bold, underline, etc. And in this case, a very basic survey design, the notion of error prevention and recovery. People make mistakes on survey questions, and that's okay. The real question is how do we help them get off the page and go to the next one? So in this case, you can see that with a very basic design, the survey software is programmed that if someone misses a row, it says your answer is incomplete. And there's a video that goes with this, and it shows how for the 3 errors that were made on the page, the consumer each of the 3 times chose the answer that was closest to the error message. So the best practice that we believe in is you should be highlighting the entire row and avoid any kind of visual cue, which does create the potential for bias. So again, from a usability point of view, there are ways that we can use this type of learning to guide better survey design, regardless of whether it's a very basic interface or a much more enhanced one. Another one is the notion, especially with flash-based ones, if it can't fit on one screen, then there are usability implications. So imagine if the one on the bottom right, which you drag answers into buckets, what happens if that was vertically laid out, not horizontally laid out? And we know because you have to left-click on your mouse in order to drag something, then if you can't see the answer on the screen, you would be less likely to choose it. And I guess it kind of brings me to the basic premise that all of us are students of market research, and software is a wonderful enabler. It's helped us find so many new exciting ways to ask questions, use complex designs online. But ultimately, the fundamentals rest within good survey design and ultimately trying to learn and apply best practices where technology continues to leapfrog us in so many exciting ways. And these fundamentals are I've come to appreciate, still almost 25 years into market research, that those are really what guide great survey design. So I hope that this has been a very brief but powerful look into an important part of the black box of the research process and how online design can impact both the consistency of the data and then from a consumer usability point of view, some pieces as well.